بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, we continue in our study of Mathara al-Qulub, the Purification of the Hearts by Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud al-Yaqubi rahimahullah ta'ala. We've spoken about the first station, the first maqam of Tawbah, and in our previous lesson we were learning about the second station on the spiritual path, the station of Sabar. And Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud continues his discussion on Sabar in what we're covering today. So after defining what Sabar is and speaking about the four types of Sabar as he explains them: Sabar in avoiding disobedience, Sabar in upholding obedience, Sabar in the face of afflictions and difficulties, and fourthly, patience with blessings. He now goes on to talk about some of the aspects of these four types. We've already spoken about patience in avoiding disobedience, and there's more to be said about the other aspects. Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud continues, patience is considered beautiful when there is a concealment of the affliction, not singling oneself out from the group. In this line, Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud is talking about Sabrun Jameel. Sabrun Jameel is a phrase used a couple of times in the Holy Quran. In Surah Yusuf, Yaqub alayhi salam uses this expression in the face of the catastrophes. The one catastrophe of losing Yusuf and of losing Binyamin. He says, Sabrun Jameel, I shall express a beautiful patience. Here Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud says that it is that beautiful patience is when there is a concealment of the affliction, not singling oneself out from the group. A number of the scholars of tafsir, when they look at these verses that mention Sabrul Jameel, say that Sabr Jameel is the sabr, the patience that is without complaint. So, as a part of that, one would conceal it or not disclose it and not be public with what they're going through. But there's something that has to be said about this. He says that it is when there's concealment of the affliction and not singling oneself out from the group. So the first one is kitman, as we call it in Arabic, to conceal. So a person may be suffering some kind of illness, and instead of being patient with the illness, they may go around telling everyone about it in a way that is complaining about the affliction. They're venting about the sickness they're going through. That person may have lost some kind of business deal, and they go around moaning and groaning about it, and they're just venting their frustration. That venting is contradictory to patience. So the Sabar Jameel is the Sabar where one's not doing that. This is as he explains it. Imam Abdul Ra'uf al-Munawi, he says in Fayd al-Qadir, his commentary on al-Jami' al-Saghir, that concealing the affliction is the apex of Sabr. So if Sabr is like a mountain, you have a base, and then you have the apex or the summit of the mountain. The summit of Sabar would be that concealment, being very stoic in enduring that trial or tribulation. So this is the first part, concealing it, not disclosing it to other people. The second one, he says, is to endure the affliction without standing out from the crowd, to be indistinguishable from others. You may be going through a lot in your life, no one would know it. You're in the jama'ah and you look like everyone else. You're acting like everyone else who, on the surface, is not going through anything. But we know that's not the case. We can look at a crowd of people and everyone's happy, everyone's smiling and enjoying themselves. But if you talk to one individual, you'll find that there's something he's going through in his life. For us, it may be small compared to what we're going through, or it may be more than what we're going through, but they're going through something. It could be financial, it could be physical, it could be something within the family, it could be anything of that nature. And then if you pull someone out of the crowd, they may share the same experiences. They have other problems they're going through. But concealing it is not ranting and venting our frustrations about the affliction to other people. But in describing this as Sabar Jamil, beautiful patience, there's a very important question that comes up. Does this mean that we cannot share our problems with any other person? Does it mean that we have to keep it completely quiet? If we share our pain, our difficulties, whatever it may be that we're going through with other people, does that sharing in and of itself contradict beautiful patience? No, it doesn't. Because what he's talking about is venting for the sake of venting. And the way you preserve yourself against that is by concealing it, being discreet with it, and not venting. Seeming in the crowd as if you're like everyone else. But if you share your problem with someone else and it's not due to venting, then that does not contradict Sabr Jamil. So for example, there's a difference between sharing your frustrations to vent and sharing your frustrations and problems to seek a solution. Imam al-Murtada al-Zabidi, who is a very famous scholar and commentator on the Ihya Ulum al-Din, he has a very massive commentary on the Ihya Ulum al-Din of Imam al-Ghazali called Ithafu Sadat al-Muttaqin. In it, in discussing Imam al-Ghazali's words about patience and concealing the affliction, he says that a person is not removed from the ranks of the patient by speaking about his affliction or his bala to a physician in order to seek a remedy for it. If a person has a physical pain and they go to the doctor, obviously they're complaining about the pain, but they're not venting for the sake of venting. They're complaining about it to seek a solution. That, he says, does not remove a person from the rank of the sabirin, those who have beautiful patience. Likewise, he says, a person is not removed from the ranks of the patient if they go to a scholar, an alim, in order to learn from him how to exercise patience and be content in the particular difficulty he's going through. Right? Because it's not just doctors who get these kinds of issues. A person goes to the doctor seeking a solution for a physical problem, but often people will go to the imam or the sheikh complaining about an existential or spiritual problem. And they ask them, how do I get over this? How do I deal with this and understand it? So they're complaining, but they're not venting for the sake of venting. They're seeking a solution. That does not remove a person from the ranks of the patient, he says. Nor is a person removed from the ranks of the patient, he says, by confiding in his close friend so his friend knows what he is going through. Not for the purpose of complaining, he says. And that, meaning this issue of complaining for the sake of seeking remedy, seeking healing, seeking help, all of this is permissible and does not remove one from the ranks of the patient because, as he says, these matters are pervasive and affect everyone. He says, مِمَّا تَعُمُّ بِهِ الْبَلْوَى. Umum al-balwa means everyone goes through this. So you can talk to your close friends about your problems as long as you're not venting for the sake of venting. If you're seeking advice, you're seeking du'as, you're seeking some perspective that will help you in your difficulty, that's beautiful, that's good. If it's with a doctor, that's needed. If it's with a scholar, that's needed. These things do not remove a person from the rank of the patient. And in all of this, it implies something really important for us. In hearing the words of Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud, telling us that beautiful patience is a patience where you are concealing the affliction and you're indistinguishable from everyone else, in that you're not venting and making a show of your difficulty for the sake of complaining. In that, there's something very important, an implication. The implication is that if we are concealing these things from most people, except those such as physicians or scholars or close friends, it implies that we should never assume that people are always okay. We should be inquiring about what's going on in their life. If they're our friend or they're our acquaintance, we should seek to know what's going on. Is everything okay? How can I be of assistance? Because people often have difficulties in life and no one will know about it because they keep it quiet. They take a very stoic approach. And that's a good thing. However, they may suffer longer because no one knows what's going on. So we need to be proactive in knowing what's going on with people in our community, asking about them. So after speaking about Sabar in avoiding disobedience, and Sabar in dealing with afflictions, what we just spoke about now the Shaykh speaks about Sabar in obedience to Allah Ta'ala. Remember, there's 4 things. We've spoken about Sabar in avoiding disobedience. We've just now finished talking about Sabar in afflictions. What remains is Sabar in obedience and Sabar in blessings. He says patience that is attributed to acts of obedience is divided into 3 types. One of the things you quickly realize in studying the Islamic sciences is that the ulama love to divide and subdivide things. They love types and categories. We already said that patience is 4 types, according to Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud. Here he's saying that one of those types, patience in obedience, is further subdivided into 3 forms or 3 types. He says patience that is attributed to acts of obedience is divided into 3 types. So ta'a is the word used here, and ta'a means obedience. The things in which we are obedient to Allah Ta'ala are either obligatory or they are recommended. So not all Sabar in obedience is considered obligatory. Some forms of Sabar in obedience are recommended because the actions themselves are recommended. So the type of Sabar in Ta'a depends on the ruling on the action. If the action is wajib, then Sabar in that is wajib. If that thing is recommended, then Sabar in that is recommended. He tells us that the person who is patient in Ta'a needs 3 states or types. He says before, during, and after the action that necessitates patience. So there is Sabar in obedience before the act of obedience. There is Sabar in the act of obedience while doing the act of obedience. And then there is Sabar in obedience after it has been done. So it's basically Sabar in obedience before, during, and after the act of obedience. He says, before, during, and after the action that necessitates patience. What is before the act is to resolve to fulfill the act of obedience. So let's take a generic example, Salat. This is an act of worship, and if it is an obligatory prayer, then patience in that obedience is also obligatory. If it is a fard prayer, then patience in carrying that out is also obligatory. So the patience that one must have before the action of obedience, in this case Salat, is to have the resolve to fulfill the action in a correct manner to have the fortitude and firmness of correcting one's ikhlas, one's sincerity. Imam al-Ghazali mentions in his Ihya that this kind of patience before the action is done is actually the first act of worship. So you have a series of actions. You would have the resolve and the intention, the patience with maintaining sincerity would come before the act is initiated. So he says that actually is an act of worship before the act is done. So this is having firmness in correcting your sincerity and removing anything from the heart that would spoil the sincerity before you do it. This is the kind of patience one needs before they do the action. It is related that Sufyan al-Thawri, rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the early imams, was once called to lead a salatul janazah, a funeral prayer. And as the rows were lined up and ready, he was standing in front of the body, and it was taking many minutes before he uttered the first takbir. And people began to wonder, what's going on? Why is he taking so long? And someone asked him, and he said, I have not yet formulated my niyyah and ascertained my sincerity in this action. It was only after some minutes that he had ascertained that he is doing this properly, with the proper intention. And only then did he utter the takbir for the janazah prayer. There's a lesson in this. That is a practical example of how he is being patient before the act of obedience, in ascertaining that it's sincere and for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud, when describing this, he says simply, it is azm to fulfill the act of obedience. But in that azm, one is making sure that it's an act of obedience unsullied by insincerity or showing off or ulterior motives. The second type is during the action, the sabar, in obedience while carrying it out. Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud says, what is during the action is to safeguard it until its completion and to be truthful. What is after the action is to conceal it. In this line, he mentions the last two, number 2 and number 3. So number 2, the patience and obedience during the action is to safeguard it until it is completed. And patience after the action is to conceal it. So this means that during the action, one maintains the sincerity until it is finished. It is not, if a person formulates a sincere intention before the action, such as salat, and they utter the takbir, there's no guarantee that at some point in the action they may show off. They may see someone observing them and they lengthen the prayer. There's no guarantee that the pure intention in the beginning will be preserved through the act till the very end. So the sabar in the commission of the act is to safeguard what they had before they started it. It's very intuitive. A person also needs to have sabar to safeguard themselves from feeling conceited, thinking, oh wow, look, I'm praying all these nice prayers and I'm such a pious person and wow, I'm really good. To avoid these attitudes, to be patient in keeping those things from reaching the heart. Another example, we'll just move on. The next one is sabar after the action. He says that is sabar after the action is to conceal it. So a part of being patient in obedience to Allah Ta'ala is to conceal the action of obedience after it is done. So this is to not mention it to others, to not divulge it, to tell others the details of your good deeds. This is basically the asl, this is the foundation, the default setting, that we don't go around talking about our good deeds. The only exception is for the person or people who are emulated, who are followed, whose example is followed, and so they need to do certain things publicly and speak about them so that others can follow them in that. This would include pious people, scholars, and the like. It would include parents demonstrating acts of worship in the house, praying in an area in the house where they can be seen so that the children can follow that. They're modeling obedience to Allah Ta'ala. They're modeling the giving of charity and other good deeds. They're modeling all of these things, so they're not hiding them from their children. Likewise, a scholar or a sheikh would do certain things publicly at times to encourage others. So they may go and give charity in a very public manner. And this is not to receive the praise of people. It is to show them and encourage them to give charity, or to show them how to do certain things properly in the Sharia. That is fine, but the default is to conceal, to keep things hidden. Another thing that requires patience after the act of obedience is avoiding spoiling those actions by doing things that would spoil them. In the case of charity, a person can give charity and they're sincere before they give it. They have patience before they do it. They're patient in maintaining that as they give, but they may spoil the act later on by reminding the recipient of their favors to them, or taking advantage of that person, thinking that because they gave them some charity, they now have this entitlement to do whatever. This is the man and adha mentioned in the Quran. Allah Ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la tubtilu sadaqatikum bil manni wal adha. O you who have believed, do not spoil your charity with man, reminding others of your favor, and adha, harming them, taking advantage of them, behaving with them in an entitled manner that causes them difficulty. That would spoil the action, and one has to be patient in avoiding that kind of thing. And we can also add avoiding feeling superiority after doing a good deed. There are people who may feel that because they did good deed X, Y, Z, that somehow they are better than those who aren't doing those things. One has to avoid arrogance. He goes on to say that now he's talking about patience with blessings. After talking about patience in avoiding the haram, patience with afflictions, patience in obedience, he now talks about patience with blessings. He says patience during blessings is to fetter them with the cord of gratitude, to eschew transgressing with them and acting arrogantly due to them, and diverting the self from inclining to the ephemeral mirage of the abyss of the lower world. So there's a lot here. He mentions 4 things. That patience with blessings is through 4 things. The first he mentions is shukr. So you show sabar with blessings by making sure you have gratitude for those blessings. The ulama say that shukr, gratitude, is saydul mafqood wa qaydul mawjood. They say it is to seek out what is lost, to acquire it, and it is to grasp or secure what you already have. Saydul mafqood means if you want more of blessings, you have to be thankful. Allah Ta'ala says, وَلَا إِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. If you are thankful, I will increase you. So if you seek an increase, you're seeking that, it's through shukr. And if you want to preserve what you have, it is also through shukr. And that is qaydul mawjood, putting the fetters or binding what you already have. You bind it with shukr. That's what he says here. It's to fetter them with a cord of gratitude. So you secure them with shukr. And the way you secure them is shukr, with the tongue and the heart, and by not using those things for the haram. You use them properly. And this will make you among the sabirin and the shakirin, the patient and the thankful. And the maqam of shukr is coming up after this, so we'll be talking about shukr in more detail. So number 1 is shukr. Number 2 is avoiding transgressing with those blessings. So being patient with blessings means to hold yourself back, because sabar, we said, is holding yourself back. Habs, holding yourself back from transgressing with those blessings. The transgression is to go beyond the bounds. When you transgress, you go beyond the limit set by Allah Ta'ala. This is called tughyan, right? The taghut, right, is the false deity or the one who calls others to worship him. But in Arabic, tagha means to exceed the bounds. If you take a bucket of water and you add a lot of wood to it, eventually as the wood's floating, but as you add more volume and weight, what's going to happen to the water? It will rise. And if you add other things, the water will continue to rise until it goes beyond the bounds. It goes outside of the bucket and spills over. And this is the tughyan, وَلَمَّا طَغَى الْمَاء, when the ma exceeded the bounds, right, and flooded. So that's what tughyan is. So tughyan in blessings is to use them in a way that is haram. So you're taking them beyond the limit set by Allah. You're not keeping them within the boundary set by Allah, and you're using them for the haram. So being patient with blessings is to keep them within those bounds. So if you're blessed with something, you use it for the halal. You use it for its purpose and not for what is unlawful. The third aspect of patience with blessings, he says, is to avoid acting arrogantly with them. And this is the false pride of istighna, of feeling that because one has something of value, one has certain material objects, one is wealthy, they forget their origins, they forget where they came from. They think that this accords them an intrinsic value and superiority over other people who do not have those things. So a lot of people, when they come into wealth, they become arrogant and prideful, right? It is said that money corrupts. However, it can also be said that money often brings to the surface what was already within the person. There are people who, when they come into large sums of money, they don't change. They're humble, they're giving, they're nice people. And then there are people who, when they come into money, all of their bad habits and bad character just become accentuated and increased due to the increase in money. So one has to be patient when they receive an increase in dunya, that they do not become arrogant with those blessings and looking down on people who do not have those blessings. Allah Ta'ala mentions in the Quran, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَيَطْغَى أَرْرَآهُ اسْتَغْنَى. In Surah Alaq, Allah says that insan, human beings, exceed the bounds. That tughyan again. أَنْ رَآهُ اسْتَغْنَى. You see this person feeling themselves sufficient. They feel that because they come into wealth, that they don't need anyone. They are independent. They've always been like this. This is an attitude of arrogance that one has to be on guard against. And the last one of the 4 ways of being patient with blessings, he says, diverting oneself from inclining to the dunya, preventing yourself from inclining to dunya. And this is very tough because, as the ulama say, any believer, any mu'min can have sabar during times of adversity. Any believer can have sabar when the going gets tough. But it is only the elite, the siddiqun, the extremely veracious and truthful among the believers, who can exercise patience during times of prosperity. And this was the great worry of the Sahaba. There are numerous hadith from the Sahaba, narrations in which they are expressing their worry about their internal condition after having come into great wealth in the Islamic conquests and expansions. When the Muslims defeated the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and they came into great wealth. Before that, they were living in very severe poverty, and now they come into great wealth, and they were worried about their internal state because they feared that that influx of wealth would cause them to incline to dunya. And you have narrations like this where they would say, such as Abu Hurairah, bukhin, how we would come into before we had nothing to feed ourselves. We would tie stones around our stomach, and now here we're eating these meals and wiping our mouths with brocade and our sleeves, expensive linen. That's the reality. He says now, concluding this chapter, from the different types, meaning from the different types of sabar, is recommended patience, such as when a sudden calamity strikes and when concealing hardships and poverty. Here, Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud is clarifying to us that not all forms of sabar are obligatory. Some are recommended. And he says that among the types of recommended sabar that are not required but they're highly recommended is sabar when a sudden calamity strikes and when concealing hardships and when concealing poverty. What he's telling us is that if a person expresses some impatience during the first calamity, this first strike of a calamity, or if they show their hardship or display it or talk about it to other people, or if they make their poverty known to others, they are not necessarily doing something that is haram. Rather, it is recommended for them to conceal their poverty, conceal their hardships, and be patient in the first strike of calamity. That said, if the expression of impatience is done in a way that is haram, then that impatience is haram. And if the expression of impatience is something disliked, then it's disliked. It takes different rulings. So what he's saying is that this is recommended and not wajib. You're not sinful if you do happen to complain to somebody about a difficulty. As long as you're not saying something indicative of displeasure with Allah's decree, or saying it in a haram way, or doing something haram as an expression of impatience in the moment. And for the others, the same applies. He says as well, another kind of recommended patience, he says, as well as when one has a miraculous experience or deep reflections, as Imam al-Suhrawardi mentioned. He's saying that it's recommended for you to be patient in concealing any karamat, any miracles that Allah may bestow upon you. And it is also recommended for you to conceal and be patient with concealing any deep reflections that Allah casts into your heart. This is according to the words of Imam al-Suhrawardi. He mentions this in his Awarif al-Ma'arif. He was a great master in the early period and the author of the famous work Awarif al-Ma'arif, which is a very relied upon book in matters of the spiritual stations. So it's being patient and keeping oneself from disclosing miracles. So what this means is, if you, let's say you go home and as you prepare your iftar, you open the pot and you can hear tasbihat in the pot. It is possible that Allah Ta'ala can create that tasbih within the food you're eating. This happened at the time of the Sahaba. They witnessed this in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. That's a miracle. According to these words, it's recommended for you to keep that to yourself. Why? Because it's a gift from Allah Ta'ala, and you don't want to share it with everyone because you put yourself at risk of becoming conceited and big-headed. Keep it to yourself, or share it with a few people that you trust. And anything is possible. The miracles are possible in every generation. Is from the aqeedah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the affirmation of the karamat for the awliya, and there's different types for different people. Likewise with the deep reflections. If you are reflecting on the Quran and a meaning strikes your heart, or you're reflecting on something in the cosmos and a very powerful meaning strikes your heart, it is recommended that you keep that to yourself. You can write it down, but you don't want to go and share it with the world and tell everybody what you received of this deep understanding, because again, you are exposing yourself to conceit, of possibly showing off, of arrogance, and so it's recommended to keep those things to yourself. So in conclusion, when we look at Sabar and the different types, whether it is Sabar in avoiding the haram, Sabar in obedience, Sabar with afflictions, and Sabar with blessings, when we look at all the examples and the types, we see that Sabar as an act of worship, as a station of spirituality, has 4 out of 5 Sharia rulings. So out of the 5 Sharia rulings, al-Ahkam al-Khams, Sabar takes on 4 of those 5. What are these 5? For a quick review, the 5 legal rulings in Islamic law, you have what is wajib, obligatory. You have what is haram, unlawful. You have what is disliked, makruh. You have what is mustahab, recommended. And you have what is mubah, legally neutral. Of these 5, Sabar can take on 4 of them. So there's no legally neutral patience. It's either praiseworthy or blameworthy. If it's blameworthy, it's either blameworthy because it's disliked or blameworthy because it's haram. And if it's praiseworthy, it's either because it is obligatory or because it is recommended. So praiseworthy patience and blameworthy patience. So of these 4, an example for each, there's wajib patience, obligatory patience. And that is patience in carrying out what is already obligatory. And patience in avoiding what is haram. That kind of patience is obligatory. So categories 1 and 2 are wajib, patience in avoiding haram, and patience in obedience. If the obedience is wajib, that is an obligatory form of sabr. The recommended form of sabr is sabr with annoyances, with offensive behavior, with harms, with difficulties, as long as you're not responding in a haram way. Then it becomes haram. You can't do that. But if the person is complaining to someone about some annoyance or some pain, they're not exercising patience the way they should. So they're doing something makruh, which means if they're patient in not complaining about those things to people, they are doing what is mandub, what is recommended. So this is to say that it's not wajib for you to keep quiet if you're suffering some pain. Even if you're venting to a friend, though that is not advisable, though that is blameworthy, and if you conceal that and you're patient with that, that is recommended. It's not obligatory in every single circumstance. What about the haram patience? We're hearing about sabr as a spiritual station, yet now we're learning that there's actually forms of sabr that are haram. But go back to the definition of sabr. Sabr is habsun nafs. It is withholding, holding the self back. So are there any situations in life, any scenarios where your holding back from something would be haram? Indeed, there are. An example some scholars give is when a person is being patient in holding back from doing what they should be doing and they don't do it. The example they give is if a husband sees a man flirting with his wife, and he holds back and just sits there and patiently takes this flirtatious behavior by this man towards his wife. This is haram because he is lacking the protective jealousy that he should have in Sharia, the ghayra. And the person who is okay with people doing that towards his wife or women folk is called a dayyuth. A dayyuth is a cuckold. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ad-dayyuth la yadkhulul jannah." The dayyuth person will not enter Jannah. If a husband sees a man flirting with his wife, trying to seduce her, a'udhu billah, and he sits back and doesn't do anything about it or even say anything, he says, "I'm just going to endure this." He's being patient, isn't he? He's being patient, but it's a haram patience. So that's very clear. Another example they give is being patient when drowning. If a person falls off of a boat in the ocean, they can't say to themselves, "I'm going to be patient and sink to the bottom. I'll just endure this." They have to try to keep themselves alive. They have to use the means. They also say likewise when an invader attacks their lands. If you have an outside invader coming and attacking and coming into your home, you don't just sit there in your home and let them do whatever and kill you. You have to defend yourself if it's an outside invader. If it is in a case of fitna or civil war between Muslims, that's different, because then you're not raising your hand to harm a Muslim because of the fitna. If they kill you, you are rewarded with Allah Ta'ala. But if it's a non-Muslim invader, you don't sit there and say, "Okay, you can come into my house and you should defend yourself." So these are scenarios they mention. As far as makruh patience, disliked patience, it is being patient with something that when done leads to a makruh state. An example they give is a person eating so little food on a daily basis that they gradually weaken themselves to the point where they can no longer stand while offering salat. If a person is patient with purposely diminishing their food or eating less to the point where they can no longer stand in salat, this is disliked. They shouldn't be patient with those situations, with their lack of food. They should seek more food. Imam al-Zabidi, after talking about these categories of patience, looking at the obligatory patience, the haram patience, the recommended patience, and the disliked patience, he says that this indicates that Sabar is not sought in and of itself. Sabar, patience, is not sought in and of itself. It is a means to something else. So when you are patient in obedience, that patience is a means to the fulfillment of that act of obedience. When you are patient in avoiding the haram, it is the means of protecting yourself from the haram. When you are patient in a recommended way, it is to do that recommended thing. So the patience is a station that facilitates obedience and facilitates avoidance of the haram. So it is a means and not an end in of itself. Wallahu wa rasuluhu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.